Sasha Obama was stopped and harassed by police officers who judged her based on her appearance. But everything changed the moment her father, Barack Obama, arrived with his security team. What happened next left everyone stunned. Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun spilled through the large windows of the Obama household, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors. It was one of those serene Washington mornings where the air seemed heavier with importance, a sense of calm before the rush of the day. The faint hum of the television played in the background, interrupted occasionally by the clink of dishes as breakfast was prepared. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of books and polished wood. Sasha Obama, 21 years old and determined to make her own mark on the world, stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom. Her reflection stared back, poised, professional, and ready for what the day had in store. She adjusted the lapels of her blazer, smoothing the fabric as if doing so could ease the growing weight in her chest. Today wasn't just another day. Today, she would stand before a room full of young activists and thought leaders to speak about racial equity and justice, topics that had shaped much of her life in both personal and public ways. Her suitcase was already packed and waiting by the door. Folders filled with research papers, handwritten notes, and highlighted references were tucked neatly inside. Her laptop, fully charged, rested in her bag next to a sleek leather notebook, a gift from her father when she first expressed an interest in advocacy work. Sasha's phone buzzed. It was a text from one of her closest friends. "You're going to kill it today. Can't wait to see you crush that stage." Sasha smiled, but the nerves didn't completely dissipate. She typed out a quick reply, then grabbed her phone charger to toss into her bag. Downstairs, her father was already at the kitchen counter, coffee cup in hand and a laptop open in front of him. Even in a relaxed setting, Barack Obama carried an air of quiet authority. Sasha often wondered if she would ever possess that kind of natural confidence, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be noticed. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, looking up with a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Barack closed his laptop and stood, walking over to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've earned this, Sasha. They didn't invite you because of your last name. They invited you because of your work, your voice. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Sasha nodded, though his words stirred something uncomfortable inside her. She knew he meant well, but it was hard to escape the reality of her last name. It followed her into every room, every interaction. No matter how much she achieved, there was always a whisper of doubt. Was it her talent or her lineage that opened the door? "You've got this," Barack said, squeezing her shoulder before letting go. "Text me when you land." "I will." Sasha grabbed her keys from the counter and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with the warm tones of sunrise. She slid into the driver's seat of her car, a sleek silver sedan that balanced practicality with elegance. It was a gift for her 21st birthday, though she had insisted on paying for insurance herself. The city streets were already waking up. People bustled along sidewalks, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging. Traffic hummed as commuters filled the roads. Sasha felt a sense of calm as she merged onto the highway, leaving the city behind and heading toward quieter stretches of road. With the music turned low, she let her thoughts drift. She rehearsed her speech in her head, going over key points and anticipated questions. Her hands tightened on the wheel as she mentally prepared for the possibility of challenging conversations about privilege, bias, and systemic inequality. About an hour into the drive, Sasha passed through a series of small towns, their main streets lined with diners and antique shops. The landscape shifted from urban sprawl to open fields and scattered trees. She felt lighter out here, away from the noise and expectations of the city. Her phone buzzed again, another text from her friend. "Don't forget to breathe. You're exactly where you need to be." She smiled, feeling reassured. The road stretched out before her, smooth and endless. But then she saw it, the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. Sasha quickly checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her registration and insurance were up to date. She had done nothing wrong. "Calm down," she told herself. "It's probably just a routine stop." She signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. The patrol car followed closely behind, its lights still flashing. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned off the engine and lowered the window. She placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her. Respectful, visible, cooperative. That's how you stay safe. The officer approached slowly. He was tall, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses that reflected her anxious face. Another officer, shorter but stockier, lingered near the patrol car, his eyes scanning the vehicle. "License and registration," the first officer said, his tone sharp and professional. Sasha reached for the glove compartment, moving deliberately. "It's in here," she said, her voice steady but polite. The officer didn't respond. He simply watched her closely. She handed over the documents, offering a faint smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man took her license and stared at it for a moment before glancing at her. "You own this car?" "Yes, sir." "Mind telling me where you're headed?" "I'm driving to Richmond for a conference," she replied. He didn't write anything down. Instead, he handed her license to his partner and gestured for her to step out of the car. Her heart raced. "Why do I need to step out?" "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice harder this time. Sasha swallowed her protests and complied. As soon as she stood, the second officer moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her up and down. "This is a pretty expensive car," he said, gesturing to the vehicle. "What do you do for a living?" "I'm a student," she answered, her voice firm. "A student driving something like this?" He let out a short laugh. Sasha felt her cheeks flush, but she bit her tongue. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" the first officer asked, circling to the driver's side. "No," she said quickly. "Drugs? Alcohol?" "No." He opened the door and began rummaging through her belongings without waiting for permission. "Hey," she protested, "you can't do that." The officer ignored her. "Ma'am," the second officer said, stepping closer, "you need to calm down." Her pulse pounded. She reached for her phone. "Don't move," barked the first officer, slamming the car door shut. "I'm calling my father," Sasha said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The officers exchanged a look. "Your father, huh? And who's that supposed to be?" She held up the phone, her thumb already pressing the call button. "Barack Obama." The laughter that followed was sharp and mocking. "Sure he is," said the taller officer, but Sasha didn't flinch. The phone rang once, twice. "Dad," she said as soon as the line connected, "I need you." Sasha Obama stood beside her car, her phone gripped tightly in her hand as her father's calm voice filled her ear. "Where are you?" Barack's voice carried a steady reassurance, but Sasha could hear the undercurrent of tension in his tone. "Highway 64, just past the Fairfax exit," she said quickly, glancing toward the taller officer who had stepped closer and was now glaring at her phone. 2 officers pulled me over. They're going through my car, Dad. I haven't done anything wrong. Stay calm, Barack replied, his voice even but firm. I'm coming. Don't say anything more than you need to. Keep the phone on. Sasha nodded, even though he couldn't see her, and lowered the phone slightly but didn't hang up. The officer nearest to her, the one with the buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice edged with mockery. "Your lawyer?" Sasha didn't answer. The officer's lips curled into a smirk. "You think a phone call's gonna make this go away?" Sasha held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I know my rights," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Oh, you know your rights, do you?" The second officer, the stockier one, circled around the car, stopping just behind her. "You think you're special because Daddy's got money? Or maybe you think we won't treat you like everybody else?" The words stung, but Sasha stood her ground. Her father's voice, still audible from the phone in her hand, reminded her to hold firm. "I need you to stop searching my car," she said, her tone measured but resolute. "You don't have a warrant, and I haven't consented to this." The first officer laughed, a short, sharp sound that sent a chill through her. "Consent? Sweetheart, we don't need consent when there's reasonable suspicion." "Reasonable suspicion of what?" Sasha shot back. The officer leaned in again, his voice dropping low. "Of someone like you not belonging in a car like this." Sasha's heart hammered. She wanted to scream, to cry, to fight back, but instead she focused on her breathing, forcing herself to stay composed. Her father's advice echoed in her head. "Don't let them see they've rattled you. Keep your voice calm and steady." "Step away from the car," the second officer ordered. Sasha hesitated, glancing back at the phone in her hand. "I said, step away." Her pulse spiked, but she obeyed, backing away slowly as the taller officer moved to the driver's side door and reached inside again. He pulled out her bag, unzipped it, and began rifling through her belongings. "Hey," Sasha protested, "you can't just go through my stuff." The officer ignored her. He pulled out her laptop, flipping it open. "What do we have here? Something you don't want us to see?" "It's for my presentation," Sasha said, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. "Close it." But the officer didn't stop. Instead, he held it up for his partner to see. "Fancy equipment. Bet she's got all kinds of secrets in here." Sasha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the shorter officer grabbed her arm. "You need to lower your voice," he said, his grip tightening. "Let go of me," she snapped, jerking her arm free. The officer stepped back, his hand hovering near his holster. "Careful," he warned. Sasha froze, her breath catching. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. Her father had told her stories about people who didn't get the chance to explain themselves. Her phone buzzed, a message from her father. "I'm 15 minutes away. Stay where you are. Don't let them push you." The taller officer saw her glance at the phone and smirked. "Waiting for your knight in shining armor?" he sneered. "Or is Daddy flying in on Air Force One?" His partner laughed. Sasha bit her lip, swallowing the words she wanted to hurl at them. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. The officers exchanged a glance, but their smirks faltered just slightly. Still, they pressed on. The taller officer opened her wallet, flipping through it as if looking for something incriminating. The shorter one started checking under the seats of the car, muttering to himself about how kids like her think they're untouchable. Sasha clenched her fists. She wanted to scream at them to tell them who her father was and demand respect, but she knew that wouldn't work. If anything, it would make things worse. Instead, she focused on the sound of her father's voice in her ear, still coming through the phone's speaker. "Stay calm, Sasha. I'm almost there." But the officers weren't finished. "We're going to need to take your car in for further inspection," the taller one announced, closing her laptop with a loud snap. "What?" Sasha's voice cracked. "You can't take my car. I haven't done anything wrong." The shorter officer stepped closer again. "Listen," he said, his tone softening in a way that felt more menacing than reassuring. "You can make this easy, or you can make it hard, but we're not letting you leave until we're satisfied." Satisfied. The word hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Sasha's phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. 2 minutes away. Hang in there. She gripped the device, her knuckles white. "Just wait," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "You'll see." The officers laughed again, but this time there was an edge to it, a nervousness they couldn't quite hide. And then, faintly, Sasha heard it, the low rumble of engines in the distance. The officers must have heard it too, because they both turned toward the road. Moments later, 3 black SUVs appeared, their tinted windows reflecting the setting sun. They pulled onto the shoulder of the road with practiced precision, blocking the patrol car from view. The officers stepped back instinctively, their bravado faltering as the doors of the SUVs opened and men in dark suits stepped out. And then she saw him, Barack Obama, stepping out of the lead vehicle, his expression calm but unreadable. Sasha exhaled shakily, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. The officers stiffened, clearly recognizing him. "Sir," the taller one started, his voice suddenly uncertain. Barack ignored him. Instead, he walked straight to Sasha, his eyes scanning her quickly as if to make sure she was unharmed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Sasha nodded, but her hands were still trembling. Her father turned to the officers, his gaze sharp. "Now," he said, "you're going to explain exactly what's going on here." The air was thick with tension. The officers, who just moments ago had been so smug and overconfident, now shifted nervously under the weight of Barack Obama's steady gaze. The presence of the former president and his security detail had transformed the scene in an instant, silencing the condescending laughter and halting the invasive search of Sasha's car. Barack stepped closer to his daughter, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Though his expression remained calm, Sasha could see the flicker of anger in his eyes, the kind of anger that simmered just beneath the surface, controlled but potent. She took a shaky breath, feeling the tension in her chest begin to loosen, if only slightly. The taller officer, the one with the mirrored sunglasses, finally found his voice. "Sir, Barack held up a hand, cutting him off. "Before you say another word, I want to know exactly why my daughter was pulled over and why her belongings were searched without a warrant," Barack said. His tone was steady, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. The officer hesitated, his confidence clearly shaken. "We had concerns about the legitimacy of her ownership of the vehicle," he said, his words faltering. "Concerns?" Barack repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of concerns?" The officer cleared his throat. "Well, sir, she was driving an expensive vehicle, and given the circumstances, we felt it was necessary to ensure there was no criminal activity involved." Barack's eyes narrowed. "Given the circumstances? What circumstances exactly?" Neither officer spoke. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Barack's gaze, while the older one adjusted his sunglasses as if that would shield him from the former president's scrutiny. "I see." Barack said, his voice dropping slightly. "Let me make this clear. You profiled my daughter based on the car she was driving and the color of her skin. That's what you're trying very hard not to say, isn't it?" "Sir, that's not—" "It's exactly what it is," Barack interrupted, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "You made a snap judgment, decided she didn't belong, and treated her like a criminal. And now you're scrambling to justify it." The taller officer opened his mouth to protest, but Barack didn't give him the chance. "You're done talking," he said sharply. "Now you're going to listen." Sasha's heart raced as she watched her father take control of the situation. He wasn't yelling, but his words carried more weight than if he had. The officers looked visibly smaller, their postures stiff and defensive, but they didn't interrupt. "My daughter has done nothing wrong. She complied with your instructions, handed over her ID, and yet you humiliated her, searched her belongings, and threatened her as if she were a suspect." Barack gestured towards the security detail behind him. "You see these men? They're here because my family has spent years under public scrutiny, years facing threats, prejudice, and hostility. And yet, despite all of that, my daughter still believes in this country. She believes in its promise of fairness and justice. And today, you tried to strip that away from her." The older officer finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "Sir, we didn't know who she was." Barack's eyes flashed. "That's the problem. It shouldn't matter who she is. It shouldn't take the arrival of a former president to make you reconsider your actions." The silence that followed was deafening. Sasha felt her pulse slow as her father's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The younger officer stepped forward, his voice tentative. "We were just doing our jobs, sir." Barack turned to him, his expression softening slightly, but his tone no less firm. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate. If you think what happened here today is acceptable, then you shouldn't be wearing that badge." The officer looked down, shame flickering across his face. Barack shifted his focus back to Sasha. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but the tension in her shoulders hadn't fully eased. "I'm fine now." Her father's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned back to the officers. "I want your badge numbers and the name of your supervisor," he said. The taller officer hesitated, but when Barack simply raised an eyebrow, he reached for his notepad and began scribbling. The security detail moved closer, their presence a silent reminder that this situation wasn't over, not by a long shot. Barack took the paper from the officer's hand and folded it neatly before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "Get back in the car, Sasha," he said quietly. She didn't hesitate, moving quickly to the driver's seat and closing the door behind her. From inside the car, she could see her father continuing to speak with the officers, his posture unyielding. She couldn't hear what was being said, but it was clear from their expressions that they were no longer in control of the conversation. After what felt like an eternity, Barack finally turned and walked back toward the SUVs. Sasha let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding as he climbed into the passenger seat beside her. "Are they gone?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied, his voice softer now. "They're waiting for their supervisor to arrive." Sasha's stomach sank. "This isn't over, is it?" "No," Barack said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "It's not over. But we're going to make sure something good comes out of it." Sasha felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety as the convoy began to move, leaving the officers standing by the side of the road. She stared out the window, watching them grow smaller in the distance. They were never going to let me leave, she said quietly. Her father didn't answer right away. They weren't, he finally said, because they didn't see you. They saw an idea, a stereotype, and that's the kind of thinking we have to fight against. Sasha looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly. What if you hadn't come? Barack's grip on her hand tightened. But I did. For the first time since the encounter began, Sasha felt a sense of security wash over her. But beneath that comfort was a fire, anger and determination building inside her. As the convoy moved back toward the city, Sasha's thoughts shifted. This wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about what happened to people who didn't have a father who could show up with a team of security agents. It was about every person who had been made to feel powerless, and she wasn't about to let that go unanswered. The low hum of engines filled the air as the convoy of black SUVs rolled to a stop on the side of the highway. The gravel beneath their tires crunched, a sound that felt heavier than it should have in the tense quiet that followed. Sasha sat in the driver's seat of her car, her pulse still racing as she gripped the steering wheel. She glanced nervously at the patrol car parked behind her, where the two officers now stood stiffly, their previous smugness replaced by something much closer to apprehension. Her father's arrival had changed everything. The back door of the lead SUV swung open, and Barack Obama stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in a dark suit without a tie, he moved with deliberate purpose, his expression unreadable but his posture exuding authority. Behind him, two members of his security detail followed, their eyes scanning the area with practiced precision. Sasha exhaled sharply, relief flooding her chest at the sight of him. But her relief was tempered by the simmering anger that still burned just beneath the surface. Anger at what had already been done, and the fear of what might have happened if her father hadn't arrived. Barack's eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, and in that brief moment, she felt steadier. He was here. She wasn't alone. He turned toward the officers, who now stood at attention, their hands nervously resting on their belts. The taller officer, the one who had rifled through her belongings with such careless disregard, stepped forward as if to speak, but Barack raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "Are you the officers who detained my daughter?" Barack's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made it clear he wasn't in the mood for excuses. The taller officer hesitated. "Sir, we were conducting a routine traffic stop." Barack's gaze hardened. "Routine? I see. Tell me, does your routine traffic stop always involve pulling a young woman out of her car, searching her belongings without consent, and intimidating her for no discernible reason?" The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His partner shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the security detail that loomed just behind Barack. Barack took another step closer, his voice dropping lower but gaining weight. "Because, from where I'm standing, this looks a lot less like routine procedure and a lot more like racial profiling." The shorter officer finally found his voice. "Sir, we had reasonable suspicion. She seemed nervous, and this is an expensive vehicle." Barack's eyes narrowed. "Let me get this straight. You thought my daughter was suspicious because she was nervous while being pulled over by two armed officers who treated her like a suspect from the moment they approached her car? And because she was driving a car that you decided she couldn't possibly afford on her own?" The silence that followed was deafening. Sasha watched as the officers wilted under her father's words, their earlier confidence crumbling into awkward fidgeting and mumbled attempts at justification. "Do you know who I am?" Barack finally asked, his voice dangerously low. The taller officer stiffened. "Yes, sir." "Then you know that I take this very seriously, and you should also know that I have every intention of holding you accountable for what you've done here today." "Sir, we were just—" "No," Barack interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make the officer flinch. "You don't get to brush this off as a misunderstanding. My daughter could have been anyone, any young black woman driving down this road, and you would have treated her the same way. And that is exactly why this stops now." Sasha's heart pounded as she watched her father dismantle their excuses piece by piece, leaving no room for doubt about the gravity of their actions. The security detail stepped forward, handing Barack a clipboard with paperwork. He scanned it quickly before looking back at the officers. "I want your names, badge numbers, and the name of your supervisor," he said. The taller officer hesitated. "Now," Barack added, and this time there was no hesitation. The officers fumbled for their identification, scribbling down the requested information and handing it over. Barack didn't even glance at the papers before passing them to one of the agents behind him. "You'll be hearing from me," Barack said, "and from the Department of Justice." The officers paled. Barack turned back to Sasha, gesturing for her to get out of the car. She did, stepping carefully onto the gravel as her father reached out to take her hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Sasha nodded, though the adrenaline still coursed through her veins. "I am now." Barack gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the officers one last time. "This isn't over," he said, and with that, he led Sasha toward the waiting SUVs. As the doors closed behind them and the convoy pulled back onto the road, Sasha let out a shaky breath. "They were scared of you," she said, turning to her father. Barack shook his head. "No, they weren't scared of me. They were scared of what I represent. And that's exactly why we can't let this slide." Sasha leaned back in her seat, staring out the window as the countryside blurred past. Her father's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she began to truly understand the weight of the fight she was stepping into. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or out of place. And as much as she hated what had happened, she knew now that she couldn't let it end here. She turned to her father. "What happens next?" Barack's expression hardened. "We hold them accountable, and we make sure this never happens again." Sasha nodded, her resolve solidifying. As the SUVs sped toward Washington, she knew that the fight was just beginning. The hum of the SUV's engine filled the silence as the convoy sped down the highway, leaving the scene of the incident behind. Sasha sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The weight of the past hour lingered, pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She kept replaying the moment the officers rifled through her belongings, their dismissive remarks echoing in her ears. Barack sat beside her, phone in hand, already typing out messages. His face was calm, but Sasha knew that calm well. It was the kind he used when he was quietly preparing for a fight. "They're going to regret this," he said without looking up from his phone. Sasha swallowed, her voice quieter than she intended. "I don't want this to just be about me." Barack paused, glancing up at her. "It won't be." She turned to face him, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. "But that's exactly what it's going to look like, isn't it? The former president swoops in to rescue his daughter, and now people are going to think this is just about privilege. What about everyone else? What about the people who don't have someone like you to call?" Her father's expression softened, but there was a flicker of pain behind his eyes. "I know, he said. "And that's why we're going to make this bigger than you and me." The car fell silent again as Barack returned to his phone, scrolling through emails and drafting statements. Sasha leaned her head against the window, letting the rhythmic motion of the vehicle steady her breathing. By the time they reached Washington, news of the incident had already started to spread. Photos of Barack stepping out of the SUV on the highway were circulating online, accompanied by speculative headlines. Obama confronts police in alleged racial profiling incident. Former president intervenes after daughter detained. Racial profiling scandal unfolds on Virginia highway. Sasha's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages and notifications, but she ignored them, her focus instead shifting to the growing unease settling in her stomach. As they entered their home, Barack immediately turned the living room into a makeshift command center. Aides and advisors arrived within the hour, laptops open and phones buzzing as they coordinated statements and prepared for the media onslaught. Sasha sat in the corner, feeling out of place amidst the flurry of activity. A young staffer approached her hesitantly. "Miss Obama, we need you to go over the draft of your statement." "My statement?" "It's important that you get ahead of this," the staffer said, handing her a tablet. Sasha skimmed the words on the screen. It was polished, professional, and completely impersonal. She set the tablet down. "This isn't me." The room quieted slightly as Barack looked up from his phone. "What do you want to say?" Sasha hesitated, suddenly aware that all eyes were on her. But then she thought about the officers' smirks, the way they had dismissed her, and the way they had dared to act with impunity until her father arrived. She straightened in her seat. "I want to talk about what it felt like," she said. "The humiliation, the fear, and not just my fear, what it means for people who go through this every day and don't have someone powerful to call. I don't want to sound rehearsed. I want it to feel real." Barack gave her an approving nod. "Then let's make it real." By the next morning, the media storm had reached a fever pitch. Cable news programs dissected the story while social media exploded with reactions. Some rallied behind Sasha, calling her brave for standing up to the injustice, while others accused her of leveraging her privilege to escalate the situation. But the backlash didn't stop the flood of support. Stories began pouring in from others who had faced similar treatment. Black men and women sharing their own experiences with racial profiling and abuse of authority. The Department of Justice announced that it would launch an investigation into the incident, and both officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending review. The police department released a carefully worded statement, expressing regret if any actions were misinterpreted. Sasha read the statement aloud in disgust. "Misinterpreted," she said, pacing the living room. "They acted like I was a criminal. They emptied my bag in the middle of the road and made jokes about whether I belonged in my own car. How do you misinterpret that?" Barack looked up from his laptop, his expression calm but sharp. "They're trying to minimize it. That's why we can't let up." And they didn't. Later that afternoon, Sasha sat beside her father as they gave their first interview since the incident. The interviewer leaned forward, her tone sympathetic but probing. "Sasha, can you describe what was going through your mind in that moment?" Sasha hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I was scared," she said honestly, "not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I knew that no matter what I said or did, they had all the power. And I thought, what if I wasn't who I am? What if I didn't have someone to call? How far would it have gone?" The interviewer nodded. "And Mr. Obama, what do you hope will come out of this situation?" Barack's voice was steady but forceful. Accountability. Not just for the officers involved, but for the entire system that allows this kind of behavior to happen in the first place. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly because of how they look or where they come from. And it's about making sure this stops. The interview sparked another wave of headlines, amplifying the national conversation about systemic racism and police reform. Activists called for immediate changes, and protests erupted in cities across the country. Meanwhile, Sasha struggled with the sudden spotlight. She fielded interview requests, spoke at rallies, and worked with her father's team to draft policy recommendations for reform. But at night, the weight of it all felt crushing. One evening, as she sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Barack joined her. "You did good today," he said, handing her a cup of tea. "I feel like it's never enough," she admitted. "Like no matter how loud we are, it won't really change anything." Barack set his cup down and leaned back in his chair. "Change is slow," he said, "but every step we take makes it harder for them to go back. That's why we keep pushing. That's why we don't give up." Sasha nodded, letting his words sink in. The following morning, the Justice Department released its preliminary findings, confirming that the officers' actions violated protocol and exhibited signs of racial bias. Public pressure mounted, and the police department announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and the creation of an independent oversight committee. Sasha read the news and felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And as she prepared for her next speech, this time at a national conference on justice and equality, she knew that her fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt ready for it. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the Obama home, casting warm patterns across the polished wooden floor. Sasha sat at the dining room table, papers spread out before her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, headlines, social media posts, and emails from advocacy groups. She knew the world was watching her now, but instead of excitement, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. The events of the past week played over and over in her mind. The flashing lights, the officers' sneering remarks, and the humiliation of being treated like she didn't belong. Even with the reforms her father had pushed for now in motion, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Barack entered the room, holding 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of her, then took a seat across the table. "Did you sleep?" he asked, studying her tired eyes. "A little," Sasha lied. Barack gave her a knowing look but didn't press. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee before speaking again. "The Justice Department's review is gaining traction," he said. "The new Oversight Committee is already forming, and the hotline for reporting misconduct is set to launch next week." Sasha nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the papers in front of her. She had read through the proposed reforms multiple times, highlighting sections and scribbling notes in the margins. On paper, it looked promising, but she couldn't ignore the questions nagging at her. Would it be enough? Would it actually change anything for the people who didn't have the resources or connections her family had? "It's a start," Barack said, as if reading her mind. "But it's only a start." Sasha looked up at him, her expression serious. "I just keep thinking, what if this hadn't been me? What if it was someone who didn't have a platform, who didn't have you?" Barack set down his coffee and folded his hands. "Then it would have been swept under the rug," he said, "just like so many other cases before it." "That's not good enough," Sasha said, her voice sharpening. I don't want to be the exception. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Barack's eyes softened, but there was pride in them too. "Then you need to keep speaking up. People are listening now, Sasha. Use that." The words lingered with her as the day went on. Sasha spent the afternoon reviewing speeches and preparing for her upcoming appearance at the National Conference on Social Justice and Equity. She had been invited to deliver the keynote address, a daunting prospect, but one she knew she couldn't shy away from. That night, as she stood in front of the mirror rehearsing her speech, the nerves began to creep in. She smoothed the fabric of her blazer, her fingers trembling slightly. "This has to be perfect," she muttered under her breath. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Barack stepped inside, his presence instantly grounding her. "You're overthinking it," he said with a small smile. "What if I mess up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," he said simply. "You know why? Because this isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. People aren't looking for rehearsed. They're looking for honesty. Just speak from your heart." Sasha swallowed, nodding, but the nerves didn't entirely fade. The next morning, the conference hall buzzed with energy. Activists, policymakers, and community leaders filled the rows of seats, their conversations humming with anticipation. Banners lined the walls, emblazoned with slogans calling for justice and equality. Sasha stood backstage, peeking out at the crowd as her stomach churned. When her name was announced, the applause was deafening. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, the spotlight making her momentarily blind. But as her eyes adjusted and she saw the faces staring back at her, the fear gave way to determination. She approached the podium, her hands steadying against the edges. "My name is Sasha Obama," she began, her voice clear but measured. "And a few weeks ago I learned firsthand what it feels like to be treated as if you don't belong." The room fell silent. She recounted the events on the highway, the flashing lights, the accusations, the humiliation of having her belongings searched and her character questioned. She didn't shy away from the details, letting the audience feel the fear and anger that had consumed her in that moment. "But this isn't just my story," she continued. "It's the story of countless people across this country, people who face this kind of treatment every day but don't have cameras or headlines to hold anyone accountable." Her voice grew stronger. "It's about systems that allow prejudice to thrive, and about the people who abuse their power because they think no one will stop them. But we can stop them. We have to." The applause began slowly, then built into a roar. Sasha took a breath, letting the energy of the crowd wash over her. When the speech ended, Barack met her at the edge of the stage, his eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a quick hug. Sasha smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead. There was still so much work to do. Over the next few weeks, the reforms Barack had fought for began taking shape. TSA employees across the country underwent mandatory bias training, and the new oversight committee started processing complaints. Reports surfaced about other officers who had faced disciplinary action, signaling that accountability was becoming more than just a buzzword. Sasha continued to use her platform, sharing stories from people who reached out to her, stories of injustice, resilience, and hope. One email stood out. It was from a young woman who had been stopped at an airport days after Sasha's story broke. "They treated me differently this time," the email read. "They were respectful. I don't know if it was because of what you said, but I wanted to thank you. You made a difference." Sasha read the email twice, then forwarded it to her father with a short message. "This is why we fight." As the months passed, Sasha found herself stepping more fully into her role as an advocate. She spoke at universities, testified before congressional committees, and even worked with her father's team to draft legislation aimed at expanding oversight of law enforcement practices. But, for all the progress, she knew the fight wasn't over. One evening, as she and Barack sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Sasha turned to him. "Do you really think things will change?" she asked. Barack took a sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "Change is slow," he said, "and it's hard, but every step we take makes it harder for people to go backward. And as long as we keep pushing, we keep moving forward." Sasha nodded, letting his words sink in. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as she looked out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The morning air felt lighter than it had in weeks. Sasha stood by the window of her apartment, gazing out at the Washington skyline as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon. The world outside bustled with life, cars honking, pedestrians hurrying to work, but inside it was still and quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sasha let herself exhale. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Another email, another story. "Thank you for speaking up. Because of you, I finally felt brave enough to file a report after what happened to me last month." Sasha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. She had read dozens of similar messages over the past few weeks, stories of humiliation, fear, and, for some, justice finally served. But this one hit differently. Maybe it was because it came from someone close to her age, or maybe it was because it reminded her so much of how she had felt standing on the side of that road, alone, powerless, until she wasn't. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, and her father stepped inside, dressed in his usual calm authority. Button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up, tie slightly loosened. "Busy morning?" Barack asked, glancing at the laptop and scattered papers on the table. Sasha shrugged. "Same as usual." He picked up one of the printed reports detailing the first results of the new reforms. Complaints about racial profiling had already begun to decline in certain areas, and the hotline for reporting misconduct had received more than 500 calls in its first week. Barack set the paper down, smiling. "It's working." Sasha folded her arms, leaning back against the counter. "For now," she said, her voice cautious. "But what happens when the momentum slows down? What happens when the cameras move on and people stop paying attention?" Barack stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Then we keep pushing," he said, "because change doesn't happen all at once. It happens step by step, and whether you realize it or not, you've already taken one of the biggest steps." Sasha let his words settle. She wanted to believe that what they had done, what she had done, was enough to make a lasting difference. But part of her still wondered if it was only a matter of time before the system found ways to revert to old patterns. "Come with me," Barack said suddenly, nodding toward the door. "Where?" "You'll see." They drove through the city in one of the black SUVs that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. Sasha sat in the passenger seat, watching as the landmarks of Washington blurred past the window. She wondered where they were going, but Barack didn't offer any clues. Finally, the car slowed, pulling up in front of a small community center in southeast D.C. It wasn't flashy, just a simple brick building with a faded sign above the entrance, but there was a crowd gathered outside. As they stepped out of the SUV, Sasha immediately recognized some of the faces: activists, local leaders, even a few young people who had reached out to her after her story went public. A cheer rippled through the crowd as they saw her, and for the first time, Sasha felt something other than nerves when all eyes were on her. Barack leaned in. "This is what change looks like," he said softly. "Ordinary people, coming together, refusing to accept the way things are." Sasha stepped forward, and the crowd quieted. "Hi," she began, her voice steady. "I want to start by saying thank you for showing up, for speaking out, and for reminding me why this fight matters." She paused, scanning the faces before her. "Standing here today, I'm reminded of something my dad once told me, that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and a lot of work. But it also takes courage. The kind of courage it takes to speak up when you're scared, to keep going when people tell you it's impossible, and to fight for what's right, even when it feels like no one's listening." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sasha held up a hand, signaling that she wasn't finished. "I've learned a lot over the past few weeks, about fear, about anger, but also about hope. And I've learned that hope isn't something we wait for. It's something we create." She took a breath, her voice softening. "So, let's keep creating it. Let's keep pushing, keep speaking up, and keep showing the world that we're not going to let this go." The applause that followed was deafening, but this time Sasha didn't feel overwhelmed by it. She felt grounded. She felt ready. Later that evening, as she and Barack drove back toward home, Sasha stared out at the city lights, their glow reflecting in the window. "Proud of you," Barack said, breaking the silence. Sasha smiled faintly. "I'm proud of us." Barack reached over, giving her hand a quick squeeze. "We're just getting started," he said. Sasha nodded. She knew he was right. The reforms they had fought for were only the beginning. The real work was still ahead, and it wouldn't be easy, but as she sat there, watching the lights blur into streaks of gold and white, she felt something she hadn't felt since that day on the highway. She felt powerful, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Share this video with your friends to keep the conversation going and help spread awareness. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories about justice, equality, and standing up for what's right.